Okay, everybody, video number 3. Before I switch back over to the BSG decision and report screens to continue that conversation, I just want to remind everybody that if there's any questions that come up as I'm going through these screens, anything you're not sure of, anything you don't understand, be sure to send me an email, make a note, send me the question, give me a chance to clarify for you. I'm also going to show you here in just a second something else besides the player's guide and besides these videos that will also hopefully be helpful as you're making these decisions. So let's pick up where we left off with the branded production and then the production facilities. Okay, so this is where we left off on the branded production screen. So right, so if you're going to make 2-star, 5-star, 10-star shoes, you make that happen here. Okay. Um, we talked briefly about scheduling production. Right, we'll come back to that later because we don't know how many shoes to make yet because we don't know how many shoes people are going to want. Okay, so we're going to have to come back to this later after we do some marketing efforts. Okay, so the next screen here is production facilities, and there's a lot to think about on this page. Okay, first of all, this is where you manage your capacity, and by capacity I mean think of it in terms of factory space. Okay, how much space do you have in which to produce shoes? If you think that you're going to be a high volume producer, meaning lots and lots of people are going to want your shoes, so you need to produce a lot of shoes, you're probably going to need a lot of factory space, right? That's okay. That's not the only way to succeed. And I'm going to show you some specific examples later of this point I've been trying to make all semester, where it's not about volume, it's not about market share. That's not how you measure success. You measure success in terms of long-term returns, right? And it's entirely possible for small companies with relatively low volume to still generate great returns. And I can show you that. Okay. Um, so let's say you are going to be more of a niche player. You're going to be a smaller company, lower volume but higher margins. What that means is fewer people are going to buy your shoes, which is fine. Um, which means you need to produce fewer shoes, which means you need less capacity, right? So for a company that's going to be a relatively small producer, if you have great big production facilities, think about what that means for you from a cost perspective, right? That means you're carrying all the fixed costs of a great big facility that you don't need. Okay? It's inefficient and it's going to cause your costs to be higher than they need to be. Okay, so the point is you need to have the right amount of capacity based on the number of shoes you need to produce, based on the amount of demand that you're going to have. Okay, so that's part of what you do on this screen is manage your capacity. Okay, now they've complicated this a little bit in the last couple of years when they updated the BSG. What they've done is they've split the capacity decision into two components. Okay, one is what I'm talking about, the factory space itself. How big is this facility? Okay, based on the facility, that creates an upper limit on how many pairs of shoes you can produce in that space. Okay. But you also have to consider the equipment, the tools, the machines that it takes to produce the shoes, right? And so what that means is your capacity is limited in two ways. Number one, you have an upper limit based on the amount of space you have, right? That's your facility. But it's also limited by the amount of equipment you have in that space. So it's entirely possible that you would have a facility, you would have a space, but not have any equipment in it. Okay, so you have the space, but you still don't have capacity because you don't have the tooling. Okay, and so a lot of implications there. So let's come back here down at the bottom real quick and just look at this space for production. Okay, so what this means is right now in North America, you have production space that's big enough to produce 5,000 pairs of shoes. You may or may not have that much equipment, but that's how much production the space itself will support. Okay. In Asia, you have enough space to produce 6,000 pairs. Okay. You have no capacity in Europe or Latin America. You don't have factories there. You may decide as a part of your strategy that you want to have capacity in Europe, you want to have capacity in Latin America. So in that case, you would build, construct new space. Okay. Um, or maybe you decide that you want your North American factory to be bigger, so you can add on additional space. Right. Same thing with Asia Pacific. Right? Now, again, your total capacity needs to be driven by your total demand. Maybe you decide as a matter of strategy, you want to not produce shoes in Asia anymore. But without that capacity, you're going to leave some people unsatisfied, right? You need more production capacity than what you have in North America. What you could do is not produce in Asia anymore and add on to North America in order to meet your demand. Okay. Um, so all these decisions, do you want more factories? Do you want fewer factories? Do you need bigger factories? Do you need smaller factories? And all of that is within your control. It needs to be something you think strategically about, and it's something that you manage on this production facility screen. Okay. Two kind of important caveats about construction of space. Okay. First of all, something they changed in the update, you can construct new space, but notice there's no place here on this screen for you to sell space. So once you've built it, you have it forever. So that forces you to plan ahead, right? Because if you, let's say, build a big factory in Europe and then decide in a year or two that you don't want to produce in Europe anymore, guess what? You're stuck with some of the costs associated with that facility because you cannot sell off the space. Okay, so you got to think about that. The other thing to be aware of when you're building space is the fact that it takes a whole year. I mean, this is a construction project. This is backhoes and construction workers building a factory. Okay, so if you construct the space this year, you'll pay for it this year, but you won't actually get to use it until next year. Okay, it takes a full year, it takes a full round in the simulation before that space becomes available. Okay, so that's all the space. Up top here is the equipment, right? So let's say right now we have enough space in North America to produce 5,000 pairs, but we only have enough production equipment in that space to produce 4,000 pairs, right? Plus overtime, so really it's 4,800, right? But let's say that's not enough. What you could do without adding any capacity, you could just add equipment to the existing space. Okay, so maybe I want to purchase more equipment to put into the space so that I can maximize my production there. Okay, that's an option. That equipment that I buy, it can either be new or it can be refurbished. Obviously, new is more expensive, refurbished is cheaper, but new is more productive, and refurbished is a little less efficient. Okay, so again, everything's a trade-off, right? With the equipment, let's say this example I'm giving, where let's say you don't want to produce shoes in Asia anymore. You want to move all your production to North America, or maybe you want to shut down North America and Asia and move everything to Latin America. It's totally up to you. What you would do in that case is you would sell your equipment, right? Because why have equipment sitting there collecting dust that you don't intend to use? Sell it, recover some of the capital, and then reinvest that money somewhere else, right? The other reason you may choose to sell equipment is, and this is sort of an interesting complication that they've added in the latest version, your equipment wears out. All equipment wears out, right? I mean, you think about depreciation in accounting terms, but in physical terms, stuff just gets old and it stops working as well. Okay, so you need to check the player's guide for the specific details, but over a certain period of time, your equipment will stop working. And if you're not aware of that and you're not planning for it, what'll happen is there will come a year when all of your equipment breaks down and it all has to be replaced. Okay, so you may want to have a plan for dealing with that a little bit at a time, plan to deal with it ahead of time, whatever, however you choose to approach it, right? Um, so in that case, what you may do is maybe sell your old equipment, so your oldest equipment gets sold first, and replace it with new equipment, right? I want to keep the same capacity, but I just need to update the tooling. Okay, so that's something you'll manage here as well. Okay, so um, let's say we're going to build a new factory in Latin America, right? Okay, it's going to be 4,000 pairs because that's what makes sense for us given our demand. Notice that I don't have the opportunity here to put equipment in it because it doesn't exist yet, right? It takes a full year for this capacity to be constructed, and then next year I'll be able to fill it with equipment. Okay, so just keep that in mind that there's that staging process. Okay. Um, I'm going to say it one more time because it's so important and it's something that people just overlook. Your capacity should be driven by your demand. Okay. I'm going to show you some examples later. I think I said in class some of the dangers of following the How to Win the BSG guides that you can find online. Um, this is a classic example, right? A lot of those guides tell you first thing, take great big loans, we'll get to later, and build a bunch of capacity because everybody knows there are economies of scale. The bigger your factory, the lower your costs are going to be, right? And we've talked about that multiple times about the fact that economies of scale are not automatic and they should not be assumed, right? Because in a lot of cases they don't really exist. Okay, this is a perfect example. If you were to do that, you take out a big loan and you build a great big factory, but you don't have enough demand to need that much factory space or to need that much equipment, all you're doing is just throwing away money. All you're doing is unnecessarily raising your costs. Okay, so capacity is driven by your needs of production, which is driven by your forecasted demand. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The other thing you can do on this screen is you can improve the factories that you have. Okay, four different options for what you can do. Um, Special equipment to reduce reject rates or equipment to increase your SQ rating. Now, some caveats, right? Again, the system is set up to force you to think strategically. Okay, so in this case, you can only do one improvement per factory per year. Okay, so if I choose option A, I can't choose any of the other options for North America, right? Um, and you can only do two improvements to any factory ever, right? So I can't just shotgun and say, in the first 4 years, I'm going to do all four upgrades. I have to be smart about picking the two that make the most sense, right? Which two are those? I'm going to say it again. It depends on other elements of your strategy. So the best upgrades for you will not be the best upgrades for another team with another strategy with different decisions in different areas, right? Different functions. Okay, and I can show you a perfect illustration of that. So let's take this option B for example, right? Layout revisions to reduce production run setup costs by 50%. Now, in the last video, I told you that more models will lead to a higher perceived value. But I also said there are costs associated with that, right? The costs associated with having more models are these production run setup costs, right? I don't know how many of you have ever worked in a production manufacturing kind of environment, but it's pretty easy to think about this way. If we're going to offer a lot of different models, that means we're going to have red shoes and yellow shoes and blue shoes and white shoes and silver shoes, right? In operations, what that means is at some point, I have to make red shoes, stop the machine, pull out the red leather, put in the yellow leather, turn the machine back on, make some yellow shoes, shut the machine down, take out the yellow leather, put in the blue leather, right? Those are the production run setups. And there's time and money associated with that. Okay. This option B will reduce those costs by 50%. Okay. So you think, does that make sense for my company? Right? One thing you can look at to gauge that is right here to say in North America, it's going to cost us $6.4 million to invest in option B, to invest in this upgrade. And our projected savings, based on all the decisions we've made in the other screens up to this point, is 1.8 million. Right? So that's a payback period of 3.5 years, I would say. I'm not Somebody else will have to do the math, right? But that's, or you can think of it as roughly a 30% return on the investment, right? A 1.8 million savings on a $6.4 million investment, that's about 30%. Okay. That's not bad. But let's come back here to production and let's change something. So remember these numbers 6.4 million invested, 1.8 million saved, right? Let's say instead of making 200 models in the North American factory, we're planning on making 500 models. Okay. Now, let's come back to that facilities. That upgrade still costs us 6.4 million, but now it saves us a projected $7 million a year. So the payback period is literally less than a year. The return on investment is over 100%. Okay. So if you're going to be a company that offers a lot of models, option B makes a lot of sense. If you're not going to offer a lot of models, option B may not make so much sense. Okay. And that same dynamic applies to all of the other upgrades as well. It's just they depend on different things, right? So reducing reject rate by 50%, well, if your reject rate is 30%, that's a pretty big savings. If your reject rate is only 2%, then it's not really gaining you a lot, right? So you've got to think strategically about these, which of these makes the most sense, okay? Um, Another mistake I've seen people make with respect to these upgrades, and again, it goes to a lack of long-term planning. It's not uncommon to see a team, a company that will spend, let's say, here's one, $57 million, right? That's a lot of money. $20 million here. They'll spend the money, and then a year or two down the line, they'll shut down the factory, right? So it's just a waste, right? You're not really getting the return on that investment that you should. Okay, so make sure you have a long-term plan based on your strategy. Where should you be producing your shoes, right? And based on that, where should you be applying these upgrades? Which of these upgrades makes the most sense? It's going to be different for every company. Okay, um, so that's basically everything on the production facility screen. Um, Distribution and warehouse. So I'm going to, okay, this is basically your logistics. Okay, so right now, as you take over the company, you have factories in two locations, North America and Asia. You can change that. It's up to you. But when you take over, you have two factories in two different parts of the world. You have historically sold products in all four regions. Okay, so think about that as a distribution problem. I've got shoes being produced in two places. I'm selling them in four places. How am I going to spread the shoes around, satisfy the demand in the different geographic regions? Okay, so I'm gonna jump back for a second. I told you that we could not schedule our production yet because we haven't done our marketing, so we don't know what our demand forecast is, and that's still true. But just for the sake of our demonstration here, just to be able to show you what you need to do in distribution, I want to assume that the demand forecast is already done at this point. Okay, when the demand forecast is done, and I'm going to repeat this again later. Okay, what you're going to see on the screen here, where it says total branded production needed in year 11, it's telling me I need to make 8,700 pairs of shoes based on my demand forecast that I haven't done yet. This number is bogus, but I'm gonna use it for the time being. Okay, knowing that later I'm gonna have to come back and I'm gonna have to change it. All right, but if we assume that this is a good demand forecast, right, what that means is this is telling me how many shoes I need to make. Down here, this total number, this is telling me how many shoes I am scheduled to make right now based on the numbers in these two boxes. Right? So I have decided right now I'm going to produce 4,033 pairs in North America. I'm going to produce 4,249 pairs in Asia. I haven't actually entered these numbers. These are defaults. But if I don't change them, this is my decision, right? And the total of those two is 8,282. Now, hopefully, you're noticing a disconnect here. My forecast is telling me to make 8,700. I'm only making 8,280. That's a problem. My production needs to match my forecast. Okay, so what I would do is I would decide, well, I need to make more shoes, and so I have to decide where I'm going to make them. Right? I've got enough capacity left over here in North America um, to just make them all here. Right? So if I make this number, sometimes you kind of have to trial and error it, right? So that's actually too much. Now I'm overproducing. Um, Ignore this warning for a second. We'll come back to that later. If I can back this off to, and if you have a calculator, you can kind of work this stuff out a little more scientifically than I am. All right. That's for our purposes. This is close enough, right? 8698 against 8700 because, and I'll say this again in a minute too, this 8700 number is a forecast. It's based on certain assumptions that we're going to talk about later. No forecast is ever perfect. And so trying to get your actual production precisely the same as your forecast is sort of, um, it's false precision, okay? Because this number here is going to be a little fuzzy, okay? You still have to trust it, but don't get too hung up on hitting it exactly. If this number I would say is plus or minus 10 to this one, you're going to be okay. All right. We'll talk more about forecasting accuracy later because you want this to match this. And then the trick is making sure that this number, which is your forecast, is right. Okay, and that's something that's a whole other challenge. Okay, now you'll notice I got this number, I got my total production to match my needed production by adding production to North America. I could have just as easily added production to Asia. And what you're going to see as we go along, that's not a flip of a coin. There are consequences to that decision. Produce more in one place and less in another, right? And that trade-off is going to be based on a lot of things, including tariffs and shipping, logistics costs, and exchange rates, and all kinds of fun stuff. Okay, so when we get into it, you got to be keeping those things in mind. The one thing I do want to point out, and this goes back to that idea of efficient use of fixed assets that we talked about when we talked about costs. I was I was I emphasized the fact that those costs are fully laden costs, all the variable costs of production, but plus some portion of your fixed costs, right? Notice right here, based on all the decisions up above, my total branded production cost in North America is $24.20. If I were to back this off, I think this number was whatever. Let's say it was 4,000. Notice how this number went up, right? Now my unit costs are higher because I'm producing fewer units, right? There are certain fixed costs associated with the factory, and now those fixed costs are being spread over fewer units. Okay, if I can make more shoes in the factory, my costs will actually go down. Now, I want to be very, very clear. That does not mean that you should just produce as many shoes as you can, because if you produce shoes that nobody wants, that's not going to help you either. Okay, you have to forecast your demand, you have to produce shoes consistent with that forecast, and you need to have capacity that's consistent with that production. Okay, that's the way in which you maximize your efficiency. Okay, so now again, forecast is bogus because I haven't done marketing yet, but I am producing the right number of shoes based on the forecast. Right now, I can go to distribution, and it can make some sense. Okay. I can't see myself here. It's getting kind of dark in here. Let me see if that, I don't know if that helps or hurts, but probably looks like a horror movie. So on the distribution screen, okay, there are three things that you need to do, okay? Three constraints that you have to meet. The first two are relatively easy, straightforward, purely mathematical, okay? The third constraint is a lot more challenging, okay? So the first thing you have to do is everything that got made in a factory needs to be shipped somewhere. Okay. So what that means in terms of what you're seeing here, each column represents a factory, right? So these are grayed out because I don't have a factory in Europe. I don't have a factory in Latin America. So I'm not producing anything there, right? Each row represents a region in which I am selling. Okay, so even if I'm making it in the North American factory, I still have to send it to the North American warehouse, or I can send it to the Europe warehouse, or I can send it to the Asian warehouse, or I can send it to the Latin American warehouse, right? Same thing for the shoes that are being produced in the factory in Asia, right? They can go to any of um, the four factories, okay? And actually, this is completely random chance, but the way things are right now, I have 3,820 pairs of shoes that I can ship from Asia, right? And they're all being shipped. Exactly the right number are being shipped somewhere. Okay, so that first constraint, everything that gets made in a factory needs to get sent somewhere. That's already being satisfied in the Asia factory. Okay, Latin American factory, the fact that this number is red tells you that it's not right. Okay, there are shoes that are being made in North America that have not been sent anywhere, right? I need to ship 386 more pairs somewhere. So I could say, all right, I'm going to send 386 to Latin America. Boom! Now I have shipped everything that I made. I have satisfied the first constraint. Okay, just to show you, let's say I made this 500. Then you're going to see a negative number, and it's going to tell you that you're shipping more than you made. You're shipping more than what's available. Okay, so that's no good either. You want that bottom number to be zero. I have shipped everything that I produced in both of my factories. Okay, good. First constraint has been satisfied. Second constraint, each region has a certain forecasted demand. Okay, I need to make sure that I'm sending the right number of shoes to the right markets. Okay. And to see that, you come down here where it says projected inventory surplus and shortfall. Again, this is based on the demand forecast. We have not done yet. It's based on our distribution plan that we've put into place up here, right? And it's telling us that based on those two things, right now we're sending, uh, what is this, North America, 74 pairs too few, right? There's a projected shortfall, right? Over here in, what's this, Latin America, we're sending them 270 pairs too many. It's a projected surplus, okay? So what that's going to mean, here there's a pretty big shortfall in Asia. So what that's going to mean is if my forecast is accurate and if I distribute my shoes in this way, I'm going to end up with a bunch of excess shoes collecting dust in a warehouse in Latin America. And I'm going to end up with a lot of pissed off customers in Asia who would have loved to buy my shoes, couldn't because I didn't send enough to that region. Okay. So what I need to do is change these numbers up here, rearrange them such that I'm still shipping everything that I made, but now these projected surpluses and shortfalls are zero or very close to zero, right? So I need to send fewer to Asia and more to, sorry, fewer to Latin America and more to Asia, right? So let's subtract 270 from this. What's that? 16 or so, right? And let's add 114 to this, right? Okay, good. So now Latin America is getting exactly the right number. Asia is getting really close to the right number. I mean, a -2 shortfall. Again, the forecast, there's a little bit of error in there, so it's not a big deal. I've got 156 pairs more that I need to ship from North America, and I still have projected shortages in these two regions. Awesome. So if I make this 24.95, okay, now I'm sending the right number to North America. I've got 82 more to send. So if I make this, what is that? Get this wrong, maybe. Yep. 1412. Okay. So now I'm sending the I'm shipping out everything that I made in each of the factories, and now these numbers are a lot closer to zero. Okay, this one, I guess I'm thinking ±5 or ±10 is okay. This may be a little out of range. I might want to maybe back off what I'm sending to Europe a little bit, um, mm, and maybe distribute those to some other regions, right? Um, okay, so now from in terms of the first two constraints, I would be relatively happy with this right here. I have sent everything I made in both of my factories, and I'm sending each region pretty close to what my forecast tells me they're going to want. Okay, so those are both good things. Now, here's where we get to the third constraint that's much, much more complicated. Okay, and it has to do with optimization. So if you look down here, there are distribution costs associated with the decisions that I've made up here. Okay. And those costs include freight, right? I have to ship the shoes and that costs me something. Tariffs, right? And tariffs depend on both where the shoes are made and where they're going to, right? There's different pairwise combinations that have different tariff implications. Okay. I've got inventory costs, packaging and shipping costs, I've got warehousing costs. I also have exchange rate adjustments, which you're not going to see that in the first year, but you will see that pop up after the first year. Okay. And so if you look at the sum total of all these things, my total distribution costs of the shoes that I'm selling in North America, $6.15. Total distribution costs of the shoes that I'm selling in Latin America, $17. That should catch your attention, right? And you should want to know why. And luckily, if you work your way back up through each of these rows in this column here, you can figure out why, right? And a huge part of it is this $9.74 average tariff that I'm paying on the shoes that I'm selling in Latin America, right? Now, Latin America is getting most of their shoes from Asia. and they're getting very few of their shoes from North America, right? You can look in the player's guide, you can look in some of these other resources that you have available to see what the tariff implications are of that. I'm guessing, and I don't want to like tell anybody what to do, but I'm guessing if you sent shoes to Latin America from North America, instead of sending so many of them from Asia, then your tariff burden in Latin America would be lower. Okay. But if you're sending the shoes to Latin America from North America, then you'd have to send the shoes somewhere else, right? Because that would mean maybe these shoes that are going to Europe now from North America would go to Latin America instead, in which case the shoes that are now going to Latin America from Asia would have to go to Europe, right? So everything still has to balance out, and it's a multidimensional problem. Two factors, two sources, four destinations. You want to craft the combination of that distribution plan in a way that maximizes your efficiency, minimizes your total distribution costs. Okay. This is one of those places where, and I just thought of something else that I need to go back. This is one of those places where optimizing one thing isn't necessarily the same as optimizing the whole. Okay. Because there's a lot of things you could do to minimize tariffs, to avoid tariffs, right? In terms of where you put your factories, right? If you built a factory in Latin America and used that factory to produce shoes for Latin America, you wouldn't have any tariffs on those shoes because they would be domestic, right? But tariffs aren't your only cost. You also have to think about labor costs and productivity and all of these other things. And it's entirely possible that you would build a factory, you would make a big investment in order to avoid tariffs. And the result would be that your overall costs would actually go up, right? So you've got to think carefully about that kind of thing, right? Um, I want to give you another example of that, that idea that you shouldn't optimize one thing. You need to think about optimizing the whole. And it pops up in a lot of places, and you're going to have to kind of figure some of this out for yourself from the player's guide. But one other place that it definitely pops up is right here in production, right? Because let's take the North American factory. You have enough space and equipment to make 4 million pairs of shoes, okay, on first shift, but you also have overtime, right? You can actually produce up to 4.8 or 4,800 pairs, I should say, okay? Now, a lot of people will, if they've read the player's guide, they will absolutely never use overtime because there's a premium, right? You have to pay people more to work overtime, right? So there's a labor premium on overtime production. Everybody knows that no matter what your strategy is, you want to be as efficient as possible. You want to avoid whatever costs you can. And so you're going to avoid second shift or overtime so that you don't have to pay that labor premium, right? On the surface, that makes sense, except labor's not your only cost, right? Yes, there's a labor premium on overtime, but think about the fixed costs associated with that facility, right? You have the factory, you're paying for the factory. If you don't use overtime, there's going to be a significant part of the day in which that factory is just sitting there collecting dust. You have to feed it, but it's not producing anything for you, right? So what that means is if you do use the overtime, some of those fixed costs are going to get spread over more units of production. Okay, so what happens in a lot of cases, and again, it depends on the specifics of how much capacity you have and how much demand you have and how efficient your facilities are and all of these other decisions. But it's really common that if you use overtime, yes, your labor cost per unit will be higher because of the overtime labor premium, but your overall cost per unit will be lower because of the fixed cost savings, right? In other words, spreading your fixed costs out over more units of production reduces the fixed cost burden per unit more than the increase in the labor cost per unit. Okay, so always remember your job is to optimize the whole, not to get overly focused on one specific thing like labor costs or tariffs. Okay. If you can keep that in mind, you'll make much more effective decisions. Okay. Um, so that's the biggest part of um, the decisions you need to make on the distribution. Ship everything you made, ship it to the right places in the right numbers, and do it in a way which minimizes your overall cost, maximizes your efficiency. Okay. The other decision you have to make on distribution is this inventory clearance. So we're going to end up talking about, I think, 3 or 4 different distribution channels. Okay. The primary one is this wholesale channel, right? Which is you produce it, you sell it to a wholesaler, right? You ship it to their warehouse, they sell it to a retailer, the retailer sells it to the customer. That's arguably that's your primary distribution channel. Okay. A second one is this clearance, which is basically, I don't know if you guys have ever gone to any of the flea markets in Chicago or the suburbs where it's a bunch of people with tents and tables and cheap socks piled up and things like that, right? That's what the inventory clearance is, right? The reason you might want to do this is it comes back to that forecasting thing. Let's say last year you dramatically overestimated demand for your product. So you overproduced and you ended up with a whole bunch of shoes left over, right? You might want to clearance that inventory for a couple of reasons, right? Number one, we're talking about a fashion product here. These are shoes. So stuff that was made last year, let's say when you made it, it was a 6-star shoe. When you try to sell it out of the warehouse next year, it's only going to be a 5-star shoe. Okay. If there are enough of them, that sort of what do you call it? That decay of the SQ could be enough to dilute your perceived quality next year. Okay, so you may just want to clearance them out to keep them from having that effect. Okay. Second thing to think about, and it goes back to that fixed cost, making efficient use of your fixed assets. If you've got a ton of shoes coming out of the warehouse that you made last year, that means that in order to satisfy this year's demand, you'll need to produce relatively few. Right? I've seen situations where a company would uh, literally produce twice as many shoes as they needed to last year, which means this year they don't even have to turn the factory on. Okay, so think about that. You're carrying all those fixed costs and you're not generating any revenue off of it, or you're generating relatively little revenue off of it. Okay, again, in that case, you may want to just ship those shoes off to the flea market, clearance them out, get them out of your channels so that it doesn't affect you in production either. Okay, um, this is only something you need to think about if you have a lot of inventory left over, right? Because if you don't, the impact that this is going to have, whether you do clearance or don't clearance, really won't make that big of a difference. Okay, so um, just things to keep about, things to think about. You can clearance from any or all of the warehouses. Um, when you see these numbers here, it can be a little confusing. If I click 100% clearance, that does not mean I'm giving the shoes away. This is not a percentage of the price. This is a percentage of the shoes, right? So if I say 100%, what I'm saying is take everything left over in the warehouse from last year, send it to the flea market, okay? Or I could say only take half of them, send them to the flea market. The other half, leave them in our normal distribution channels, okay? So um, that's another decision that you have to make on um, your distribution screen here, right? Now, in terms of understanding the interrelationship between these different functions, let's go back to zero, right? My branded production was based on my demand forecast, right? Total branded production needed in year 11, assuming that I'm not going to clearance last year's inventory, right? So last year's inventory is available to sell through my normal branded distribution channels this year, okay? If I were to clearance these, notice how now it's telling me that I'm going to have a shortage in North America. Clearance these. Now I'm going to have a shortage in Europe. I'm going to clearance these. I've got a shortage in Asia. I'm going to clearance these. I'm going to have a shortage in Latin America. And if I come back to production, now this was 8,700. Now it's 8,900 because those shoes from last year that were available to sell in my branded distribution have been clearanced and sent to the flea market. Now I actually need to produce more this year in order to satisfy what I think demand is going to be this year. Okay, so again, you if you work linearly down through these decisions and don't recognize the recursive nature or the interdependencies, you're going to make mistakes. Okay, so if you change something here, you will have to come back and change something. Okay. All right, so I have no idea what this video is looking like. Um, those are the highlights. Those are the most important things I want you to think about on these screens. One thing I want to point out before I sign off, and I'll probably repeat this again, but you've got at your disposal for your benefit as you make these decisions. You've got the player's guide, you've got these videos. One more thing I want to point out, you've got some help screens. Okay, you've got a help document and you've got video tutorials. All right. Sorry, what should I say? None of these things by themselves will be enough to help you succeed. But if you take advantage of all of them, it will be a huge help, right? So, for example, this help document has all kinds of information in it about this particular screen, right? So each screen has its own help document. This is the branded distribution help screen, 9 pages, PDF. You can search it if there's a particular keyword or a particular question you want to get addressed. It's not opening on my computer for some reason, but trust me, it's there and it's spectacular. Okay, here it is. Um, so, oh, this actually changed. Sorry, I said there was a 1 star penalty. It's actually 0.3 stars. So it's less of an issue than it used to be in the old system. Okay, but it'll tell you about inventory clearance. It'll tell you about your projected cost. It'll tell you about all of these things. Okay, it'll tell you about the exchange rate, which is something that's really going to have an effect on you. We'll talk about that more later too. Okay, so um, I'm going to cut it off here to hopefully keep this video from being too burdensome. But as always, if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to let me know. More to come.